What you are about to see is the aftermath of the day Palestine was taken from its people, a story of promises, lives uprooted, and a conflict the world has never resolved. This is not just history. It is the beginning of a struggle that still shapes lives, headlines, and futures to this very day. In 1947, the world voted to partition Palestine. On paper, it was presented as a solution, but for Palestinians, it was the start of a catastrophe. What followed was not peace, but displacement, destruction, and exile. This is the story of what happened after the vote, and why its consequences are still felt nearly 8 decades later. The Nakba, 1948. The Arabic word Nakba means catastrophe, and for Palestinians, it captures the enormity of what happened in the months that followed the United Nations' decision to partition their homeland. Almost immediately after the November 29, 1947 vote, violence spread across Palestine. Tensions that had been building for decades exploded into armed clashes between Jewish and Arab communities. In towns, villages, and cities, the streets became battlegrounds. Gunfire echoed in marketplaces, homes were abandoned overnight, and entire neighborhoods lived in fear of what would happen next. For Palestinians, who made up the overwhelming majority of the land's population, the vote felt like a betrayal. They had never been consulted, never given a choice in how their land would be divided. And now, as fighting intensified, they faced the harsh reality that the vote was not just words on paper. It was transforming into a war on the ground. By the spring of 1948, the situation had escalated beyond repair. Zionist militias, better organized, better armed, and often supported by resources from abroad, launched coordinated campaigns. Villages were surrounded and emptied, homes were set ablaze, and families fled, believing they would return after the violence subsided. But most never did. When Israel declared independence in May 1948, what Palestinians feared had already become reality. By the end of that year, over 700,000 Palestinians had been uprooted from their homes. Some fled to neighboring Arab countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Others ended up in makeshift refugee camps that, generations later, still exist today. More than 400 Palestinian villages were depopulated or destroyed, their names erased from maps, their lands taken over by new arrivals. The Nakba was not just the loss of land, it was the shattering of lives, identities, and futures. Farmers who had tended their fields for generations suddenly became refugees. Children who once played in courtyards found themselves behind barbed wire in camps. Families who carried the keys to their houses, hoping to return one day, passed those same keys down to their grandchildren, still waiting for the chance to go home. For the world, the Nakba was just one chapter in a larger geopolitical struggle. But for Palestinians, it was everything. It was the moment their homeland slipped away, the moment exile became their reality. If you believe the world should remember the story of Palestine, if you believe the Nakba should never be forgotten, then share this video. Let more people know the truth of what happened. And follow Days Gone By to keep learning the stories history tried to bury. Israel's Declaration of Independence, May 14, 1948. While Palestinians were fleeing their homes and entire villages were being emptied, another story was unfolding in parallel. One of triumph and celebration for the Zionist movement. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, stood in Tel Aviv and read aloud Israel's Declaration of Independence. With that speech, the State of Israel was proclaimed to the world. For many Jewish people, this was the culmination of decades of struggle, lobbying, and survival. After the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, the idea of a sovereign homeland represented safety, renewal, and the chance to finally stand independent in the international community. Streets in Jewish neighborhoods erupted with celebrations, music, and dancing. For them, this was the long-awaited dream made real. But for Palestinians, the very same moment was marked not by celebration, but by despair. Israel's birth as a state coincided with their dispossession. On the day independence was declared, Palestinians were already living the Nakba. Villages burned, families scattered, refugees streaming across borders. The declaration, to them, did not signal freedom, but the cementing of their loss. The international community quickly recognized the new state. Within hours, the United States extended recognition, followed soon after by the Soviet Union. This rare agreement between two global rivals during the Cold War revealed just how much geopolitical weight was behind Israel's creation. Arab nations, however, rejected the declaration outright. For them, it was a violation of the principle of self-determination. How could the majority population of the land be denied their independence while a state was created for newcomers? The declaration was seen not as a resolution, but as provocation, and within days, neighboring Arab armies mobilized for war. What the world celebrated in Tel Aviv, Palestinians mourned in silence. The same event carried two entirely different meanings. For one people, a beginning. For another, a catastrophe. The stage was now set for the next chapter, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The day after Israel declared independence, the region was plunged into full-scale war. On May 15, 1948, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq entered Palestine. Their stated mission was to defend the Palestinian Arab population and resist what they saw as an imposed and unjust state. What followed was a brutal conflict that lasted months and redrew the map of the Middle East. Israel, though newly declared, was not unprepared. Zionist militias such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi had been organizing and training for years. With foreign support, better coordination, and access to arms shipments, some coming from post-war Europe, Israel was able to mount an effective defense. In many areas, these forces not only pushed back Arab armies, but also expanded beyond the territory allocated in the UN partition plan. For Palestinians, the war only deepened the catastrophe of the Nakba. Entire towns were emptied as fighting spread. Families who fled in fear expected to return once the war ended, but their absence was used to justify permanent dispossession. By the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled about 78% of historic Palestine, far more than the 55% originally allocated by the UN. The remaining land, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, fell under Jordanian control, while the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration. But no Palestinian state was ever established. What had been promised in theory disappeared in practice. The war left scars on every side. Thousands of soldiers and civilians died in combat, but the heaviest burden was borne by Palestinian civilians. Over 700,000 were displaced, their homes confiscated, their villages destroyed. For them, the Arab-Israeli War was not just about shifting borders. It was the final seal on their dispossession. For Israel, the war became known as the War of Independence. For Palestinians, it was an extension of the Nakba, a war that confirmed their exile. The conflict also reshaped the Middle East. Arab governments, humiliated by their defeat, faced unrest at home. Refugee camps swelled with Palestinians, creating a humanitarian crisis that would last generations. And the unresolved questions of statehood, territory, and return set the stage for every conflict that followed. The war did not bring resolution. It cemented division. And at the heart of that division was a city that neither side was willing to let go: Jerusalem. Jerusalem's fate. No city carried more weight in the conflict than Jerusalem. Sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, it was supposed to be treated differently from the rest of Palestine. Under the UN partition plan of 1947, Jerusalem and its surrounding areas were to be placed under international control, a corpus separatum. The idea was that no single group would claim sovereignty, ensuring the city remained open to all faiths. On paper, it sounded like a compromise that could prevent conflict. But in reality, the plan unraveled almost immediately. As fighting spread across Palestine, Jerusalem became a central battlefield. Neighborhoods were divided by gunfire and barricades. Roads into the city were blockaded, leaving civilians cut off from supplies. For residents, the supposed international protection promised by the UN never arrived. By the end of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Jerusalem had been split into two. West Jerusalem came under Israeli control, while East Jerusalem, including the Old City and its holy sites, fell under Jordanian rule. Barbed wire and checkpoints divided neighborhoods that had once been connected. Families found themselves on opposite sides of a border they could no longer cross. For Palestinians, the loss of East Jerusalem in later decades would become one of the most painful symbols of dispossession. The city was not just another piece of land. It was their cultural, religious, and historical heart. The idea that Jerusalem could be taken, divided, and later annexed felt like the deepest kind of theft. For Israel, gaining West Jerusalem was a victory, but it was incomplete. The city's eastern half, with its religious landmarks, remained outside their control until 1967, when another war would change the map once again. What Jerusalem revealed most clearly was the failure of international promises. The UN's plan to protect the city collapsed, leaving its fate to be decided not by diplomacy, but by force. And that failure only deepened Palestinian mistrust of the international community. In many ways, Jerusalem became the microcosm of the larger conflict, a place of profound meaning, promised fairness, but delivered division. And for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now scattered in refugee camps, the battle for Jerusalem was only part of a larger ongoing tragedy, the loss of their homes, lands, and futures. That tragedy would come to define their existence, the Palestinian refugee crisis. By the time the guns fell silent in 1949, the map of the Middle East had been redrawn, and with it, the lives of millions of Palestinians. The war ended, but for them, the struggle was only beginning. More than 700,000 Palestinians had been driven from their homes during the Nakba. Some fled in fear of advancing militias, others were forced out by direct expulsions. Entire villages were emptied, their lands confiscated and handed to new arrivals. The homes they locked behind them were often demolished, repopulated, or erased entirely from maps. Families who once lived in thriving communities became stateless overnight. Many fled to neighboring countries. Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria became home to vast numbers of Palestinian refugees. Others crowded into makeshift camps within the remaining Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These camps, built with the hope of being temporary, became permanent fixtures. Tents turned into concrete shelters, and entire generations grew up behind barbed wire, carrying the memory of villages they had never seen but were taught never to forget. Today, millions of Palestinians are still classified as refugees, their status passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, a living reminder of the displacement of 1948. The international community responded with humanitarian aid, but not with justice. In 1949, the United Nations created UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, to provide food, shelter, and education. But while aid was given, the core issue of return was ignored. Resolution 994, which affirmed the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, was never enforced. For Palestinians, the refugee crisis is not just about geography. It is about identity, memory, and dignity. A farmer's key passed down to his grandson, a grandmother's story of the olive trees she once harvested, a family photo rescued from a burning home. These became the symbols of a people determined not to forget. And yet the world largely moved on. Borders were redrawn, new states were recognized, and superpowers aligned themselves with one side or another. But for Palestinians, exile was not a political question. It was their daily reality. The refugee crisis remains one of the deepest scars of 1948. It is not frozen in the past. It continues today, as millions of Palestinians remain displaced, stateless, and waiting for justice. The story of Palestine after 1947 is not just about the loss of land. It is about the endurance of a people who refuse to let their history be erased. From the Nakba, to the war, to the division of Jerusalem, and the refugee crisis that followed, every chapter carries the weight of promises broken and lives uprooted. But it is also a story of resilience. Despite exile, despite loss, Palestinians continue to hold on to their identity, their culture, and their hope for a future where justice is possible. If you believe the world should remember Palestine, if you believe history should not forget the people who were displaced, share this video. Let others know the truth that too often gets ignored, and follow Days Gone By for more rare moments of history that still shape our world today. What happened in 1947 and 1948 was not just a distant event. Its legacy continues to define the Middle East, international politics, and the lives of millions of people. To understand the present, we must never forget the past. This was not just the aftermath of a vote. It was the beginning of a catastrophe, and the story of a people still fighting to be seen, remembered, and free.